Welcome back to another episode of the Shed Geek Podcast. Working, we're really putting in the hours right now, John. We're working overtime. We're on Saturday.
That's right.
Man, I tell you what, that's dedication right there.
Anymore, it's like, do we have weekends, right?
I forgot what weekends are at this point. I just work all the time. Maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe I should.
Yeah, my wife tells me that it's not a good thing.
Yeah, we went hiking a few weekends ago. Maybe we need to stop and do some more of that because taking in the beauty
Fun.
of God's creation, it sure does do a lot for my soul. So anyway, John, you want to introduce yourself to the shed industry and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, my name is John, John Varner. I'm actually the founder and CEO of a new company that we launched, I guess, a little over a year ago called Digital Shed Builder. And our primary focus right now is to build the very best shed configurator possible, right? Just to give you a little bit of background on kind of who we are. We're actually here at Digital Shed Builder. We're all from the Silicon Valley, originally anyway. And so our lead developer, his name's Peter. He's an aerospace engineer.
Okay.
There's myself, who I have my master's in animation and visual effects, right? Which is movies. I have some of my best friends are at some of the biggest studios, right? ILM, Pixar, and so forth. And then Hunter also has a degree in animation and visual effects. And so it's a very small team, but we are a very focused team. And we've been building configurators of one shape or another for many, many years. I think we're going on 15 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been a while. And when we set out, it wasn't like, oh, let's do a shed configurator. In fact, we had a dealer reach out to us kind of out of the blue. We were in between positioning products because we had just recently launched another configurator product, and he knew that, and we were right in that transitional phase. He's like, "Hey, why don't you consider the shed industry?" And of course, we knew very little about the industry, but as he kind of introduced us to the possibilities of what we could do with a configurator, again, from our perspective, it was very much about the visual fidelity, right? Making it look really nice.
Mhm.
And not knowing so much, too much about the shed industry, we kind of sat down as a group one day, and we're like, do we really want to go down that road, right? And you and I were talking just a little bit ago about the nuances of the shed industry, right? Because you've got,
Mhm.
even outside, you got sheds, you got carports and things like that. And I think ultimately that's kind of what pushed us over the edge in terms of, yeah, let's go down that road. Because what's interesting about sheds is that they're deceptively complex, right? Because if you think about a shed, it's got a roof, walls, window, door, right? And so from a surface level, it's like, well, it's not that complex. But then as we built the configurator, as we kind of went down that road, we just realized how nuanced it was. And we're still learning, right? We're continually talking to dealers. And what's neat about where we're at right now is that we are right on the ground floor, right? Like we don't have a huge established product where we have difficulty kind of manipulating code bases and things like that. And so, as I reached out to you, what we're really wanting to do is kind of connect with more folks in the shed industry and have them tell us what you need, right? Because you have, and the shed dealers that we've talked to have that institutional knowledge. They have that knowledge of, this is what works for us, and then allow us to come beside you and really, really, really help you out. So in a nutshell, that's kind of who we are. And again, I invite you to check out our website, digitalshedbuilder.com. But yeah, we're very excited about what we're doing, and really kind of getting introduced to the shed market has definitely been really fun.
So what's one of the first things that you noticed immediately as you entered into the shed space in comparison with building like 3D configurators to building 3D configurators to other industries?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back just a little bit here in terms of our history and the configurators that we've built. Our original concept when we were doing configurators was that we wanted to do more of the bespoke work, more of that custom type work, right? And one of the challenges associated with that is that custom work is very difficult to build via code, right? There's a lot of hands-on work kind of building it, and we kind of went through that process, and then we started to realize that we wanted to hit verticals that we could tool more and more efficiently, right? So in our team, we don't actually have a team of 3D modelers, right? Building the content and all of that. I mean, granted, there's a few components that we still do by hand, and obviously we're going to tool those over time. But when we started, getting into the shed industry, like doing the shed configurator, we actually spoke to the dealer and just said, hey, the guy Mark that reached out to us, what is it like? Give us your top 5 things that you want in a configurator, right? And of course, the first thing was quality, right? And without getting way into the weeds, there's a lot of things to consider when you're talking about quality, right? When the experience is running in the browser, obviously there are hardware limitations and things like that you have to consider. So things like, what does the light look like hitting the shed, right? Because it affects what the color looks like, right? And you want the paint to look accurate. So that way, a shed doesn't, a customer doesn't order a shed and then realize, oh, snap, this doesn't look like what I thought it was going to look like, So that was the biggest one, was quality. And that's where we focused primarily at the beginning, most of our effort. The second thing was cost. And as I was describing kind of early on, there's usually a huge upfront expenditure in terms of creating the content, right? And a lot of companies, they'll either try to, they'll charge up front, or they'll try to build it into kind of the payment structure, right? And we didn't want to do that. And so it actually took us over 2 years to build. But one of the things, the biggest thing for us from a processing standpoint, is we tooled the process down to the T, right? So, for us, we don't have a 3D team building this stuff out so much as we have software that we can coordinate to create it for us, right? And so because of that, we don't have things like upfront costs. There's no need for a contract with you're with us for a year or whatever. And then the third thing that they kind of hit us with was, what's the lead time, right? Like from when I say, I want to do a shed configurator to the point that it's on my site, like how long is that, right? And of course, that's variable depending on how quickly we can get the content to start building from, right? Because obviously we need something, even if it's just a picture of it, right? We need something to know. And generally speaking, what we have discovered is whatever they have on their website in terms of photos is enough for us to actually build a shed. Because honestly, when you're looking at a shed in the configurator, no one's going to be able to be like, ooh, that's a ½ inch off, right? It's more about making, connecting with the customer, giving them the experience so they can make those decisions to buy, right? And so while the math behind our platform is really intense, like it makes even my head spin, the goal is to, in terms of what we deliver, is simplicity, right? In terms of making sure that everything is as simple from a customer decision making standpoint, right? And then the fourth thing there, I think, was the contracts, but we kind of hit that, but that was, they didn't want any kind of contracts, right? And so we kind of worked on that. So anyway, those were kind of the very first things that we saw as we were getting into industry, and the biggest, challenges that we're going to have to tackle as we got in.
So yeah, there's no doubt. I like to say all the time, the industry is kind of fragmented in that you have large companies, middle-sized companies, very smaller mom and pop style, some that want to grow, some that just want to maintain. But then same with sizing and styles, some don't want to go into this, 16 by 40 and plus buildings. Some don't want to, maybe add, I don't know, corbels or gosh, I don't know, just all this different nuance to the shed that really customizes it. And then some want to customize it big time with dormers on top and multiple dormers and different style windows. And it's got to be a challenge, I would think, from a coding perspective, knowing my little bit about tech that I do, but understanding that coding is where the value is and takes place in building the vision for the program, right? For any software, it's got to be a nightmare to constantly go back to the board and say, let's do this over and over and over, or they add a new style or a new size. I mean, does that create a lot of work? I would imagine.
Yeah. So the way that we've actually tooled our process, and again, this is something we set out from the very beginning, and it was the result of kind of education that we've had in the past. I and Hunter have been developing software for quite a while, right? And the term feature creep is like the one thing that scares every developer, right? And so when we actually set out, we actually built our platform modularly. In other words, we didn't think of a shed as a whole, right? Like this is a unit. We actually broke it down conceptually to kind of the sum of its parts, right? And so what's really neat about that is, as we were talking earlier, we're not limited to sheds, right? We can do sheds, we can do chicken coops. So much so now, we could, in theory, do play structures. We haven't, officially released that yet, but we approached it in a very modular way. And that is actually, interestingly enough, that's tied into the visual fidelity component of it, because there's different ways to approach the problem. You can, render everything, and that means process within the browser in real time, everything like lighting and so on. And then the higher fidelity stuff is more pre-processed, right? And so how do you combine those two to provide the best experience? And yeah, without a doubt. And again, this is why we've been working on it for well over 2 years, right? Is because we wanted to, from the very beginning, address the very problem that you kind of expressed, right? Which is like all of the different sizes, all of the different combinations. And because from our end, we refer to them as permutations, right? Like how many permutations are there going to be? And then how do we address that? And then alongside of that, one of the things that we've learned over time is it's all about driving customers to a decision, right? Getting to them that point of comfortability. And to your point, what we've discovered is if it's overcomplicated, like from a development side, we can do a lot of stuff, right? But then the question is, should we be doing all of that really technical stuff, right? And for us, it's all about driving customers' decisions. And so the features that we've implemented first are the no-brainers, right? Changing wall colors and siding type and roof and all those. But we're currently, one of the features, it's not quite ready, but we're actually actively working towards, is something like augmented reality, right? It's a very cool concept, right? You have your phone and you can kind of see it in your space. But one of the things that we are researching on our end is, does that really drive customer decision-making, right? It's cool, but does it drive customer decision-making? So everything that we do on our side in terms of building it out and the complexity of the software, it's really about facilitating customer buying decision. And again, we have a limited scope in terms of what we know, like I said, the obvious ones. But beyond that, that's something we still plan to learn. But again, because the code base is written the way that it is, it's very modular. So I can take bits and pieces and pretty much do whatever we want. But again, focusing on customer decision making.
Man, that's great. I think a lot of times when you're inside an industry, and I think this is true for the shed industry as well, when you're inside an industry, you get tunnel vision at times. And I love earlier that you said, is that a half inch off, or, is the customer, really viewing that? Because we live in sort of this, I like to call it a shed life or a shed journey, like it's, because it's what my day is consistent of. It's the people business ultimately, but it's the people involved in sheds and the nuance of sheds. And so you get so educated on whether it's different products, different services, different types of sheds, different shed companies. I know for a fact that there's haulers out there listening that can see another hauler going down the road, and probably for them it's based off the rig. They can almost tell who's coming down the road, but they can certainly see the shed and know whose shed brand that is. But does that play out for the customer? Does the customer see two sheds going down the road or on the side of the road and say, same shed company? Because the only thing you really have is branding. They don't know that maybe this company only makes these types of sheds unless you really market that and do a good job to penetrate the market and make them understand that, hey, we don't sell cookie cutter. We sell, quality or customization or whatever it is. Because I've had customers come in and say, I want a specific style of shed. And I've had customers come in and say, I just need something to hold my mower. What's your bottom dollar?
Sure.
Whatever. On your,
yeah, for sure.
So I can certainly see 3D configuration at the point of sale for a quality customer more. Someone who wants to match colors on the house, someone who wants to just visualize before they hand you the check or sign the paper. So for me at the point of sale, like, what do you do to kind of help drive that decision? I guess what I'm asking is like, we know in the industry, but they don't know. They just want to see a design sometimes, right? Just show me about what
is kind of that's exactly kind of what I'm hoping to express is that there are the obvious things that we know about that drive decision making, right? But there are things that we even as developers aren't necessarily cognizant of, right? To your point. And so, I guess what I would say there's, do I have all the answers in terms of what drives that customer decision? I would, being honest, no, I don't, but I would love to know. Right.
Tell me too. I want to know too.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that's also kind of tied to that we're also learning is, let's say the customer makes that decision, right? They're like, I love this shed. This is what I want. And then they make that decision to buy, right? What does that customer journey look like after they do that? Currently, right now, our system, once a customer is ready to buy, they hit get a quote, and then an email is sent to the dealer, and then the dealer can engage, right? But long term, we want to even be able to facilitate that, right? And so kind of looking down the future, probably 6 to 12 months, we're actually, now that we're kind of wrapping up things on the configurator, there's a couple of small things that we're still wanting to dial in. But long term, we're actually going to be building out an entire suite, right, of shed tools tied to the configurator. We're kind of internally labeling it, the digital shed lot, right? So kind of thinking more in terms of, because again, while we bring tech, we still, the industry has an established way of doing things, right? And we want to help kind of take advantage of that, so to speak, right? Yeah. And so in terms of the digital lot that we're kind of aiming for here is we still want to incorporate what we know works in terms of if someone comes to a lot, like what does that sales process look like, and kind of bring that onto a digital platform and still be able to kind of exercise those same sales strategies only in a digital format as opposed to, a physical one where they're actually there.
So with that being said, you kind of have, you kind of have like some different things on your website. I mean, the e-commerce integration. Tell me a little bit about that or your thoughts.
So that's
where you want it to go.
Sure. That's an ongoing kind of education even for us, right? So the way that it actually integrates, we have different types of customers, right? Some of them, they're just a dealer, and I'm not trying to say that in a bad way. Sorry if it came out funny. But you have a dealer who, has extremely busy, doesn't have time to like build up a website. They don't have the resources to have like a developer go in and do all the work, right? Yeah. And for those, we definitely want to facilitate that their ability to do that, right? And so we actually have some third-party vendors that we can recommend, and then they can help them set it up and integrate it that way. But then we have other customers that are more tech savvy, right? And they want like, well, what does an API look like? And so currently we're working on an API to give fuller integration, right? To the point where like some customers like, well, right now we host all of the content, right, on our servers. And they're like, well, we want to be able to host that content for controllability reasons, right? If our site goes down, they don't want to suffer for it, right? Our site's never been down, but I understand the mentality there. And so again, we want to facilitate, we want to help them out, right, in terms of providing a fuller solution. And so when we talk about e-commerce integration, just being honest, it's still a little bit nebulous. It's more to trigger that conversation, so then we can figure out how best to help you, right? So it's not like a true e-commerce integration where we have like a templated website, because that was definitely something that we discussed inwardly. But the one thing that we wanted to make sure was that we weren't a cookie cutter approach, because in fact, we were talking to a gentleman, was early this week, and he was like, I need this configurator to be competitive, right? And if everyone is doing exactly the same thing, how do you be competitive, right? And so we don't want to, on our end, we don't want to dictate, you need this type of website that looks exactly like this, right? We will work with you to cultivate whatever that end solution looks like, right? And again, we're not wanting to be a cookie cutter solution so much as we are helping each individual company cultivate and use our software, our player, to better improve their online sales or whatever their goal ends up being, right? So anyway, I know that was kind of a rounded answer to a question, but that's kind of where we're at from an e-commerce standpoint.
I think that each company has a vision for what they want to do, typically speaking, with their shed manufacturing company. And even if it's that fragmentation looks like a manufacturer who supplies the dealers with a 3D configurator or full system, as opposed to Shed Lot who just purchases wholesale and then turns as a retailer, but needs a way to show them buildings that aren't on the lot what they could purchase and what those additions, of those items would look like if you put a dormer here or a porch here. Maybe they don't have that on the lot to compare to. And maybe even if you do, you've got to go through all these details of, it's going to look like this. And, they don't get a good visual for it because you're trying to give them the visual that you're changing 50% of the content of the building, the description of the building, like, well, it'd be just this size, that style, this color, porch here, going to change this up. And in their mind, what it looks like is different. And that's one thing that you guys say on your website. Where was it at? Let me get away from the pricing even before that. Buying is a visual experience.
Right. Exactly. And to your point, when you can't see it, right, you're really limited by the capabilities of that individual's imagination, right? Like a guy like me being a designer, you could explain it to me and I could really visualize it in my head. Some folks aren't wired that way, right? They're like, well, what does it actually look like? And so the configurator, what's nice about the configurator too, is that a shed doesn't even actually have to physically exist somewhere, right? Like it doesn't have to. From a pre-construction standpoint or pre-con standpoint, you can actually visualize it before it exists, right? And so from like a customization standpoint or whatever the case is, it really facilitates your ability or the buyer's ability to say, yes, that's exactly what I want, right? As opposed to being in their mind. And I know this is true about me. I'll be like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I want if I don't actually physically see it. And then I get it. I'm like, well, maybe not after all, So yeah, the less you can leave to their imagination, the easier it's going to be for the customer to make that buying decision, right? And so that's where the configurator really fits in, is you're giving them that comfortability to be like, yep, I want to buy it, because they have actually seen it, even though, like I was talking to one gentleman, and he was saying that it was eerie that, he had been playing with the configurator so much where he was like, it almost felt real to him, right? In terms of how he was engaging with it. And then when he actually saw it on his lot, he's like, wow, that connection is real, right? In terms of what you see online versus what actually shows up. And again, that ties into our number one priority, which is fidelity. And that's something we won't stop working on. The goal is to get it to that photorealistic. I mean, that's the goal, right? It'll be time and before we can get there. But the goal from the fidelity standpoint is to give that customer 100% confidence that what they're seeing is what they're getting, right? And so that's kind of how we look at, the buyer journey in terms of being able to see it before you buy it being so critical.
And because buying is such a visual experience, I think that's why there's a couple of stages that it seems as though the buyer goes through. There's, not everyone takes the same pathway to purchase, but, they may be going down the road. Something may catch their attention, and it may very well be the quality of product. It may be the size, the design, the style, the color. Right. And then sometimes it could be that someone comes in and has a need, and you've just got a rock star salesperson that really knows how to, get in the mind and answer the questions and help the customer to the best of their ability. And maybe that's just being kind. I remember a guy who told us, put out some coffee and oatmeal cream pies. I mean, what's it going to hurt? Sometimes it's the little things in the sales approach that matter. And sometimes it's the awesome visual graphics that really grab them. But either way, it seems they take a different approach. I think a lot of times the shed buying journey starts online, at least from a research perspective. So because we find ourselves in this unusual time of the digital buying era and the era of Amazon and all these different places that allow you to buy online, and it's made it fairly convenient for me. We also find ourselves in this position of wanting to visit brick and mortar, right, and still have a customer experience. So what's your impression on how Digital Shed Builder will kind of play a role to both of those customers?
Yeah. So as I was kind of explaining earlier, that is something that is still a customer. I mean, it's still a journey for us, right? In terms of how we're going to facilitate that, because again, we are a tech company, right? That's just kind of who we are. But to your point, we don't want to get so narrowly focused in terms of our thinking that we're like, oh, we're going to sell everything online.
That's right.
Which is not, it just isn't going to happen.
That's right.
And right now, like I was saying, we can send the dealer the information, and they can help facilitate the rest of the sale, because from our perspective, we don't want to extricate our configurator from the traditional sales process, right? Because to your point, having a cup of coffee and sitting talking to somebody matters, right? Yeah. So, I don't have all of the answers there. And again, that's kind of like, well, I'd love to know, like, I'd love to talk to more folks. I mean, even if folks come to us and they're like, well, I don't need a configurator, but here's my opinion, we'd love to hear from them, right? Sure. Because to your point, we are trying to facilitate that sales process, and that sales process is not just an online one, and it's not just super focused on the configurator. Although, granted, we could sell completely online. Like we had, this is on a previous configurator, sorry, that we built. He was doing everything, brick and mortar way in terms of selling, right, his product. And then after we built the configurator for him, 90% of all his sales was online. Right. So, where the shed industry is in terms of how much can be done online versus how much you have to kind of do that, digital handshake between the content online and the actual salesman. I still think that's something that needs to be, continually worked on. Right. And we will definitely take our best stab at it. Right. Because we understand that there's a relationship there. But yeah, again, I don't have the answers, but I'd love to talk to more folks and kind of work through what that would actually be.
No, that's great. Couldn't agree more. Trying to figure out the way the customer buys is way more important than the way I sell, and just using the tools that are available to sell, whatever path they came in on. If they rode in on a boat, that is, hey, I checked you out online and I tried to do the design thing, but I messed up a couple of times. Can you show me like what you guys have or what you can do. Now your rock star sales guy jumps in and he has to know his product and his service, and he has to say, yeah, let's get you set down and let's take a look at making sure I can give you the right visual for
Sure,
what you're getting.
exactly.
People buy from people they trust. So you want to create trust with the tools you use as well. If
Correct.
it's a 3D digital builder, if that's, your website of creating, having your inventory available for them, having a specific product available for them, instilling confidence in what the shop can do. We can do that in a lead time that we say we could do it in. All of those things matter.
Yes, they do.
What are some unique features? Obviously, so it's a fairly, I think I'm okay saying this, it's a fairly competitive field in and outside of the shed industry, because everyone is trying to get a visual for online sales. And
yeah, for sure. When we set out, right, as any good business would do, right, we did market research in terms of what other options were out there, right? And to your point, it's fairly competitive. But again, kind of swinging back to what drew us in the first place, is our biggest advantage that we have is visual fidelity. And the reason for that, and again, I don't want to get way in the weeds here, but a lot of solutions that we were looking at, they're functional and they have their place, but they were more CAD-ish, if that makes sense. They look more like they came out of a CAD piece of software as opposed to a catalog, for example, right? And so our biggest, at least at the beginning, that visual quality is really what sets us apart, right? It just doesn't probably matter to a lot of people, but like even the shadow on the ground, right, was important to us. Like how does that shed feel in a space, right? That matters to us. And so I would say for us, the number one thing that makes us stand out is our quality, right? And then, as we were talking earlier, because of the way that our systems is set up, other advantages that we have is that we don't have that giant upfront cost, right? To get a configurator, we have to spend X before we can even get the configurator off the ground. We are a very lean, mean machine, right, in terms of how we have it set up. And again, because of that, another advantage we have is lower wait times, and then of course there's no contracts associated with us. And we talk about customer, people who are buying a shed, their journey. There's also a journey of the shed built, distributor or shed individual who wants to integrate it, but they have decisions that they have to make also, right? Like, here's my site, how's it going to integrate, and all of those things. And so for us, simplicity and the more complex, and this from a sales standpoint, right? The more complex you make the message, the harder it is for them to make a decision, right? Yeah. And so for us, trying to keep things simple, and to your point, it's challenging. It's a balancing act. Like yes, we can build every feature, but do we want to? Is that really going to help? And so I think that's another advantage that we have as well, is that we are approaching it from a very simple standpoint, not overcomplicating the problem, and instead giving the dealer the comfort as well, knowing that, okay, these are the features that I need, right? And they're going to have them without overcomplicating the experience and ultimately overcomplicating it for their customers. So I would say those are our strongest points of advantage in terms of what sets us apart from potentially other ones that are out there.
You have a couple of looks like examples on your website under both sheds and carports that you've already built, as sort of a classic, style that you see for the most part in the shed industry. Maybe I'm getting too much in the weeds here, so if so, just let me know. What does it look like if a customer says, well, hey, I have this particular style? Is there long lead times? Are you able to knock those things out pretty quickly?
Yeah, every shed, and again, don't want to get into the weed too technically. And
Sure.
I struggle with that. I'm a developer, right? So I'm like, I know I don't want to, get people too confused. But the way that we actually have it set up, again, I mentioned kind of the modular approach. We think of it as Lego pieces, right? So for us, what you saw on our website is fairly standard, and those came from the original dealer that reached out to us. Those are his sheds. But in terms of complexity, we were working recently with an individual that had a edge case or a use case that we hadn't anticipated, right? Where we had, it was basically a kind of a complex roof system, right? Where you had multiple angles and things like that. And what we ended up doing, and this is what we'll end up doing with all of them, sometimes if it's a uber complex edge case that we haven't addressed before, it might be a slightly longer lead time. But the way that we address them is not on a per shed basis. We actually build more software to support that edge case. And so, right now it's really neat. You could literally throw any shape building at us and it would be the same as if you threw a smaller one at us, right? Or a more standard one. But it's because of the modular approach that we've taken. And a great deal of this, what's interesting is it's not necessarily on the player side, but it's on the tooling side to actually create that content. And so, again, I don't want to give too much of our IP away, but literally our process, my 10-year-old son could probably build a complex shed. I mean, that's how simple we've made it. But again, for all of the reasons above, right, we actually made it that simple so that we could address some very key challenges in terms of lead time, in terms of cost. So we've really kind of built it from the ground up to address those problems, as opposed to like building a product and then trying to compensate for those problems. So yeah, right now, like I said, we just did a chicken coop. We did our first chicken coop. And as you can imagine, with the coop and the run, just how complex that, motion will be in terms of size. And like one of the sizes, they didn't want to have the run at all. They just wanted to show the coop. So we can do that too, right? So again, it's because of the initial approach that we took. And again, this is very nerdy, I get, but because of the approach that we took, we actually can now, those larger problems like contracts, wait times, and things like that are not an issue for us, right? So we can pretty much kick out anything at this point. Speaking of play structures, I know we mentioned that earlier. Even that is something that hopefully in the next couple of weeks we will also be advertising on our site, because now what was interesting when we set out, we were working just on sheds, but because of the approach that we took, it's now kind of taken us full circle back to where we were originally in terms of just configurators in general. So play structures is definitely going to be on there. I think trailers will eventually be on there. And then outside of that, kind of that shed umbrella, I think we're looking at mobile homes and other things like that, where it's kind of that same modular concept, right? Made of, it's a unit comprised of its subcomponents. So yeah, we're very excited about what we can do these days.
Well, it's same for me. I mean, obviously life's about a shed, and shed means other nuance. Like we discussed earlier, it means maybe you build pole sheds or pole barns, on the side. Maybe you just do a few a year, but maybe you offer play sets, and maybe you do the installation, maybe you don't. Maybe you do carports, and I would say most probably don't do the installation, but they at least understand what it's like to be a sales lot, especially if you're a sales lot, a consignment lot that moves sheds. You might need more ways to pay the bills, so why not get some percentage on carports too, right? So for me, I've been at least around it enough to, even if I don't understand it perfectly, I know that talking about the products and services that are out there that do touch these dealer lots, it just makes perfect sense to kind of include some nuance about that and find out those people's stories, because that's one of my favorite things about Shed Geek Podcast is being able to meet people, witness to people, be witnessed to, and build friendship and relationships. It's networking, right? I mean, that's what it's doing and the purpose of it. So why not talk about these other things that are nuanced to sheds that help make a living. I know shed companies that started selling carports and far outsold in carports what they did sheds, and vice versa, and shed lots that introduce people to carports and being a carport dealer for them, and vice versa. So yeah, I totally get what you're doing with the configurator there, how it kind of comes full circle, because I feel like it's kind of done that for me, to where going to the NFBA shows, I think next week's the IBC out in Vegas. I really wanted to go to that. I can't wait till my wife can work with me full time, so maybe we can travel together. But I mean, these row forming shows and all of this, and all that's interesting, both from a vendor perspective, but just a networking and relationship building perspective. Cost is a concern a lot of times. I noticed that you have pricing on your website, so I felt like I could just kind of ask you about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And here's what I would say about the pricing. Again, just kind of being very candid. We kind of looked at the market in terms of market research, right? And we're like, well, this is where the competition is at, right? And so currently we have kind of the 3 different primary plans, right? So 1 to 3 sheds is $250 a month. 4 to 8 sheds is $500 a month, and then 9 to 15 is $700 a month. And so those are our plans, right? But again, and I say this in all genuineness, if that price for you is like, oh my gosh, this would kill me if I did it, let us know, right? We are very flexible. Again, because of the way that we built the process, we can help you, right? We can help facilitate getting a thing on there, because just being candid here, we're not in it to get rich, right? We've got other apps that we're doing, right? We're here to help people, right? And so, our pricing structure is there because we feel it's a fair market price. But don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're ready to help, right? And in fact, my team, said, hey, look, let your folks know that, the first 10 folks that reach out to us, we'll give them like say they have 4 to 8 sheds, we'll give it to it at the lower tier. And we're happy to do those types of things. Because again, for us, it's really about engaging with the community and just, meeting you where you're at. We're not like, we have to make this exact amount, because again, we don't have that upfront cost per se, right? So we have a lot more flexibility. And again, from the very moment that we started down this journey, down the shed path, right, that was something. And I've been a startup guy my entire life, and so I have a real softness for the guys who have smaller sheds, or in terms of the number of sheds or smaller companies. I have a real heart for those folks, and so again, don't hesitate to reach out. We're going to make it work for you one way or another.
Man, that's great. There's nothing I love more than seeing believers come together and having conversations that find a way to overcome the obstacles. Cause that's really the hardest thing to do. And, man, I appreciate your heart for what you're doing there, and the design and the things that you've made. Anything that helps the shed industry. I'm a fan. I'm a fan immediately. I want to either talk to you or know about what you're doing. It's just cool. And this has been a little bit in the making. And I know that we talked early on when you were still just kind of getting started, or at least pretty much getting started, I think. Or
we had literally just launched kind of beta. Yeah. When we first spoke.
So, man, that's great. I'm a believer that people buy from people they trust. And I think that one cool thing the podcast gets to do from coming on there is you can repurpose that content for that very reason to put on your website or your socials. And a lot of people ask me, what's the best views? I even had someone ask me recently from an advertising perspective, do you have any trends that you see? And I said, well, I got to be honest with you. The highest performing podcast are those who help promote it themselves and repurpose it themselves and put it on your own socials. I'm a fan of win-win. So when you do that, it helps me and it helps you too. So
yeah, no, for
why
sure.
not do those things?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny. You just mentioned, and I'm going to go on a little bit of tangent here, but in terms of repurposing, one of the other things that we learned was that there's a need for the configurator, right? But a lot of the marketing is actually happening on Facebook, right? A lot of the marketing is there. And so, we internally, we've been working through how do we repurpose the configurator in different formats to be able to address even things like that. So, for example, a lot of people don't know that you can actually have a 3D model that you can spin embedded in a post, in a Facebook post. So you can actually rotate it. Obviously, we can't bring the entire configurator in there, but we're looking at ways of being able to bring that content, again, kind of meeting people where they're at, right? And bringing digital content to Facebook in terms of 3D. We're also looking at things like creating videos from the 3D content, because we have the model, right? And we have it in a really high fidelity state. So being able to do videos and things like that, they're all on our roadmap, right? I'm not saying we have everything ready right now, but just kind of hopefully give you an idea of kind of where we're headed as a company. Again, really kind of embracing the Shed community as it is, and then kind of stepping in and saying, hey, where can we help you, from a technical standpoint. So yeah, it's really neat what we can do potentially, even from a repurposing standpoint and marketing in general.
I'm far from a consulting voice. I try to just help where I can. I certainly try to be more of maybe a connector and a relationship builder than even a salesperson or yeah. So for me, really the goal whenever I think about like repurposing your content, I'm like, hey, how can I help you? That's what boils down. Money seems to find a way to work it out. It's all God's. It's his time. It's his money. He'll do with it what he pleases. So for me, but if there's, so I don't want to play consult here, but if there's one thing I've learned in this industry in particular, it's not just that I've talked a lot, it's that I've listened a lot. And really, if you listen to the industry, the one thing I know for sure is overpromising and underdelivering just doesn't work. I appreciate that you said, hey, that's not ready, so that's not ready, but we're working on that. And then it's that, and then it's communication afterwards, because people really appreciate that. I feel like in this industry, I noticed that early on whenever I was selling, I was like, oh my goodness, we can't just do anything to get the sale, can we?
Yeah. How painful that truth is.
You want to sell, and maybe that makes me a bad salesperson to admit that on air, but that's just, I think you just have to do that. You have that mindset to say, hey, I'll do what I say I can do. So anyway, just throwing that out there, not trying to put on my consulting hat, but that's just my
no, I appreciate it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, because there's definitely a this is where we're at right now in terms of what you see on the site. That's what we can deliver. But I think it's also exciting, like if you're going to invest in a product, to be able to see where that product is headed, right? And so that's why I think, even though I can't deliver those at the moment, I think it's still really important to kind of voice those, because our buyers are making a decision, and they want to make sure that they're making a smart one, right? In terms of like where are you headed? And again, our approach being simplicity, we're kind of starting simple in terms of our configurator is relatively comparable to other ones that are potentially out there. Obviously with our strengths that we kind of outlined earlier. But at the same time, some of those things, like augmented reality and those types of things. One of the advantages for me in terms of articulating those is it allows for people to, reach out to us when we talk to them to kind of help cultivate what that final product might actually look like, right? So we have like a broad, like we're going to do augmented reality, but what is that going to look like from the final product standpoint? And so voicing them earlier on, as opposed to, waiting till it's ready, is that I can start getting feedback now before it's ready. And that way I can deliver a product that's actually meaningful, and already been kind of tested, right, so to speak, from a shed dealer's standpoint, as opposed to me saying, I know everything, here's what you need, go for it.
That's going to be my tagline. I know everything you need. I think it was Richard Miller said something the other day in a Facebook post. I don't know if you know Richard, but he said, I know all the things, no need to lecture me. I know all the stuff. So it was really, whatever it was really good. So that's my favorite comment of all year. And of course he was saying it jokingly, but I really liked it. And so I'm gonna put you in a hot seat real quick. We're about to wrap up, but people buy from people they trust. What's some cool things about John that people might not know outside of coming from Silicon Valley and being in Pennsylvania now and trying to engage into this shed industry? What's something that you can share interesting about your life?
Yeah. So, without, I'm a religious man. We've talked about that, and I don't want to just go there, but that's where I'm at, if you know what I mean, on my life outside. One fascinating thing that a lot of people don't think about is that, and we talked about this earlier, California, when people think of California, think of it as a super liberal state, right? San Francisco and so on. But I grew up in what's known as the Silicon Valley, which is a very conservative, at least it used to be a very conservative, ag driven, right? Walnuts, almonds, things like that. It's a very kind of conservative belt. And I actually, I have my bachelor's degree. So my master's is in animation and visual effects, but my bachelor's is in pastoral ministries, right? So I was going to be a pastor. The Lord worked a different way in my life, so I didn't end up becoming a pastor. But if you want to ask, you ask, what's something unique about me that you want people to know? I would say that's it, right? The Lord has worked in my life very, very, and not in a way I expected, I should say, right?
Yeah. Oh, and I bring
that same when we're working on these types of things, right? I've learned not to have expectations, if you know what I mean. It's just like, okay, this is going to be fun. Let's apply everything we've got to it, and just see where the Lord leads. So, again, I realize that's more of a testimony, but again, that's where I'm at.
No, that's good. What's a day in the life of John? What's something maybe like unique outside of being a tech geek?
Okay, so I have two modes. I have working and fishing, right? So
nice.
I used to when I were in California, I used to kayak fish in the ocean, right? So I love to do that. Monterey was kind of like my weekend home. I would go there and pretty much spend every weekend. But obviously moving to Pennsylvania, I don't have the ocean here, unfortunately. But I've been really impressed with the steelhead fishing. I've been going up with my cousin. We've been walking the creeks, catching steelhead. So yeah, again, I have two modes. I have working and fishing. So
that's
outside
awesome.
of work, that's what I do.
My son is turning into quite the fisherman, and just, I mean, to be honest with you, you and him have a lot in common. He's wanting to just go broad with computer science initially for his bachelor's degree, which he's going into, but he hasn't quite figured out how to narrow that down to coding or development or what that is, and so I'm trying to, in not being a very techie minded person myself, trying to stay out of that, but just motivate him and encourage him to pursue whatever really grabs him, and
sure.
And that's what he wants to do. Because I promise you, just much like the finding my home here in the shed industry and with the podcast, and really wanting to do podcast even more and more full time than what I am already. If you find that level of happiness, the money tends to find its way to suit, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. And if you point that forward to a sovereign God, and trust me, I mean, I've been Judas's kiss himself. I understand what it's like to be imperfect and saved by grace and all of those things, and need those reminders constantly. So, but I just tell him, just do what you love. Honestly, if you enjoy it, it really doesn't matter. Don't just do it because you'll walk into a 6-figure salary on this or on that. Just those things are cool and they offer you a lot of freedom, but none like the freedom of doing what you enjoy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And first off, I would say, have them reach out to me. I've been in it for close to 20 years now, and I can definitely, shed some light on things if you
And he loves
like.
fishing too, by the way. That's why I said.
Oh, well, there you go. There must be a connection there, some sort of, cause and effect thing in place there.
Right.
But yeah, it's funny you mentioned, the money and finances. One of the things about Digital Shed Builder, and actually all of the companies that we've built, my wife and I, and Hunter's been part of a lot of those, is that we don't have an investor behind us, right? So all of this has been bootstrapped. And as you can imagine, with any bootstrapped processes, there's a lot of headache there, particularly around finances. And again, what makes, I really enjoy about Digital Shed Builder in general is that all of our team members are in 100%, right? We all believe in what we're doing, to your point about loving what you do. And so, eventually we hope everything is successful, but we don't necessarily focus on that. We focus on like what we're doing, what keeps us excited, what wakes us up in the morning and keeps us going. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about being happy about what you're doing, because that, and don't get me wrong, I actually make a fair amount, right? But that's not what makes me happy, right? That ebbs and flows, comes and goes. But if you're doing what you love, that's where it's at.
That's great, man. If people want to find out more about you, where do they go to?
Yeah, I think the best approach is just to go to our website, digitalshedbuilder.com. There's a contact form on there. Just go ahead and fill that out. And either I, Julie, who's our secretary, or Hunter will reach out to you, and we'll get that conversation going.
That sounds great. I appreciate you working on a Saturday, and I hope you have
I appreciate you.
Rest of the weekend. Maybe hang on here when we get done, and we'll talk fishing.
Sure.
I'd love to.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Have a conversation there. You're a man of faith. We like to pray here on the Shed Geek Podcast. Would you like to close us out today, John?
Sure. Absolutely.
All right.
All right. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we do thank you for all that you've given us. We thank you for the opportunity to share what we're doing with those in the Shed community. Lord, I pray that regardless of what happens, outcomes, or whatever, that you would be in it, and that you would guide each and every one of us according to your word and your will. In your son's precious name, amen.